This episode is brought to you by Pre-Roller. You can now get the best pre-roll machine on the market at 0% interest on a 36-month lease. Visit preroller.com for more details. That's preroll-er.com for details. Hello and welcome to Grow Opportunity, the podcast. I'm your host, Haley Nagasaki. I'm the editor of Grow Opportunity. And today we are joined by Rob Laurie. Rob is the founder of Lucem Law Corporation. And he's been a long time in the cannabis space. I want to jump right into it. How are you doing today, Rob?
I'm doing excellent, Haley. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
For sure. It's been a few months in the making, so I'm glad that we're able to sit down and do this.
Oh, definitely. Glad to be here.
Yep. And so let's get situated. So you're on the island now, but you're from Vancouver originally?
That's correct. I'm born and bred in Vancouver, grew up in Richmond, but went to school in town. And I'm definitely a West Coast native, and I absolutely love living on Vancouver Island. Like Nanaimo, I can see Vancouver from my street. I hope I don't sound like Sarah Palin there, but it's kind of the reality. Vancouver's there when I need it. 15-20 minute flight on a float plane or a helicopter, and then I can be there and then be home back in time, well in time for dinner. I love it.
It's fantastic. I agree. When I lived on the island, I always thought that Nanaimo was probably the best place because it's so central to the entire coast. You can get over to Tofino, you can get to the mainland, Victoria, Up Island. Like, it's just perfect.
Here's how I look at it. You can be downtown in court, doing your thing at meetings, right? And then 15-20 minutes later, it's like you're in a Beachcombers episode. And I guess the difference between Nanaimo and Gibson's is there's more meth in Nanaimo. So imagine Beachcombers with meth. That's Nanaimo.
Oh my God, that's awesome. Oh man, I love the Sunshine Coast too.
And everybody looks like Relic because they're on meth. Except for maybe the bikers and the lawyers.
Shit, that is so funny. Okay, so how'd you get into cannabis, and tell me about your history with using it as a medical patient?
Well, that's a very loaded question. So about high school was really when I got into it, because my younger brother's best friend was a weed dealer, which in those days there was either like organized crime, bikers, and knowing this guy who was totally independent, who basically was a dealer on the west side of Vancouver to all the private schools and the fraternities and the university, right? So he was sort of in an interesting lane with like organized crime and gangs on one side and outlaw biker clubs on the other, which, in the early mid 90s, weed was very different. So I was fascinated by that. And at the time too, we had a family friend that was tasked with a royal commission. And that's where the whole like BC bud term started coming from. Because in those days, a pound of BC bud was trading in dollar for dollar value with basically a pound of cocaine, which was incredible. Or an ounce of cocaine to a pound of weed.
Oh, crazy.
Something like that. And there was this parity, and BC bud was on the map. So for me, with sort of being in that space and growing up with it, and by the time I was in university, the BC Compassion Club was making all this headway of compassionate access. So really, to me, being ADHD and interested in medicine and learning about the medicinal value as well as the ecological value of cannabis, plus reading the liner notes to Cypress Hill Black Sunday, and attending a very interesting private school where a lot of people smoke weed, really, I don't know, it just struck a chord with me that I'm very lucky that, I got all this other training and experience that's not weed related, which is very valuable to the weed related work that I've been doing now almost exclusively for over 10 years now. But I think I regarded having been in the weed space for over 30 years now. Fantastic. One form or another.
Yeah. And so before Lucem, what were you doing in law?
So before Lucem, I graduated law school at Oxford and basically ended up in the city of London, like in the fodder and the capital markets and finance world, which and as a young man in those days, we used to all want to be like in finance because it was big money, easier hours than lawyers. And in those days, everyone was borrowing and lending and capital markets was on fire. So that was, interesting as a young lawyer, being at big American and British law firms working on like massive deals.
Right.
So I ended up working for a firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, which effectively is like the CIA's law firm on Wall Street. I mean, you can't get more skull and bones and more Goldman Sachs if you tried. And, it was awesome. I'm grateful for that work, but I guess you just know when something isn't right. I mean, I wanted to be like Bud Fox in Wall Street, Charlie Sheen, and get into this world of finance. But I don't know, it just didn't seem like it was right for me. And in fact, I can just on a side note, I can remember, telling the partners like that just wasn't for me, and getting off the bus that night in Angel, which is like a neighborhood in North London. And at Blackwell's Books, there's this big book on a pedestal with a light shining on it, which was I Have America Surrounded, The Life of Timothy Leary, which I went in and bought. And about 3 pints later, I'm reading this book going, why am I not representing clients like this? Kind of jump fast forward. I had to requalify as a lawyer in Canada, which during that time led to reading, like the Canadian constitutional cases like Kane and Malmo Levine, which like every first year law student has to read that case, which was one of the cases at the very beginning of the litany of litigation, as John Conroy calls it. And then, with was it Parker and Stepopoulos, Barron, with then Smith or Allard and then Smith, like I was reading about these lawyers, Kirk Tucson, well, John Conroy, and Kirk was sort of John's junior, and now Kirk is Kirk, and then Jack Lloyd and these other lawyers. So really for me, something changed, like reading these cases, dealing with medical patients and medical access really resonated with me while I was requalifying as a lawyer. And I mean, I went back to UBC. I basically just sat in the law library using the law resources, sitting in on classes where, students would say, hey, who are you? Right? Because I was the only guy with a pad of paper and a pen. Everybody else had laptops. So ultimately it was great. I got to like learn new tips and tricks, meet the up and coming, lawyers, bond and connect with them, plus prepare for these exams and really look at, well, what do I want to do? And so at one point I did my articles at BLG, big firm, then worked for a smaller firm before getting poached to work as a litigation counsel, which again, moving over from corporate law into litigation. And the reason I got the job was because I beat out a 6-year litigation lawyer because I could read a balance sheet and understood finance. Right. So finally, this London experience was being of relevance in Vancouver. And it turned out the Silver Court case was the largest short and distort securities fraud case in history in Canada. And this was about 11 years before Robinhood and GameStop and these other type of cases. And so just to sum up, I was going to New York once a month for meetings with the FBI and the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission. I couldn't have been even more like close to the Wall Street action if I tried. And so in a way, it was this wonderful moment where I got to combine this London experience with Vancouver practical, which was amazing until that litigation ended. And I found myself, well, what am I going to do next? And so, yeah, I pretty much started at Lucem after working for a buddy's mining company who, like, they IPO'd as the #2 IPO in junior mining. I knew him from Silvercorp, absolute genius. And in fact, we were meeting with William F. Buckley Jr.'s nephew on the day that gold crashed more than $200. And at that point, I'm like, what the fuck am I going to do? Well, all this legal training and experience, I started at Lucem. In fact, my mom came up with the name. And in fact, when you're master and commander of your own ship, but I mean, I had to go back to basics. I had all this big law firm corporate experience and, I'd worked and engaged very sophisticated litigation lawyers at about 7 international jurisdictions, but I needed to learn the law myself. So I ended up signing up for legal aid and doing legal aid as a legal aid lawyer, doing family and criminal law and constitutional indigenous cases. And ultimately, for the first year or so, I was doing whatever work crossed my door. But then weed people started coming to me because they're like, hey, you know the industry and you have a corporate experience. And I started connecting with people that were serious growers, like dudes who were 8,000 lighter growers, which were like Walmart in those days compared to your average grower. So I got to learn through, these guys, as well as, from my brother's friends growing up, which, as a side note, Johnny was Seth Rogen's dealer for 7.5 years.
So funny.
Which was one of the reasons why I wanted to get in the law in the first place, was getting people out of trouble and be a voice for those that don't have one. So I have this kind of an interesting practice that's quasi-criminal, mainly with administrative law, with a corporate commercial focus. And all I do is work with cannabis and psychedelics. So really the seminal moment where all of these diverse pieces came together, plus being ADHD and having understanding of Ritalin, and medicines, which were a nice contrast for how cannabis was being bastardized, and just the stigma and bias around it was so highlight for me that it made sense. So when Vancouver decided to regulate dispensaries in 2015, I was literally out of the closet. I remember going with my wife to City Hall to basically present during the public hearings on this. And there was Kirk Dusaw, who I'd met a few months earlier. He asked me to be a guest speaker on the very first continuing legal education society of BC's cannabis symposium. Yeah, him and John Conroy were co-chairing. And so there was Kirk, and I joked with Kirk, with my wife. I said, hey, honey, how are you enjoying date night at City Hall? To which Kirk just bursted out laughing. But it was everybody in the cannabis industry was there, right? It was the 50 Shades of Green from Hillary Black of the BC Compassion Club, Canada's, well, one of the earliest, if not the first, compassion clubs, right down to like Dom Briere and Limelife and these other operators that, were taking unique stands against the government. And of course, Dana Larson in that mix. So I spoke at City Hall and it resonated with the room. And really after that, I just felt like, this is right. Not only am I a good lawyer, but I recognize, and these issues resonate with me. And I just always looked at it from a point of view of, imagine how different my life would be if Ritalin, which again, I was on Ritalin from about the age of 4 and drinking coffee. I mean, it was, my parents were almost, I guess, desperate for, hey, how can we get this very exuberant but intelligent child, or, figure these things out. And so, as a quick side note, we lived in Texas when I was a kid. I started grade 1.
Oh, cool.
I still remember my Pledge of Allegiance. And it was actually the first place I can remember hearing the word marijuana, which in a Southern accent, marijuana, is how the, Houston, the Sheriff's Department and the Houston Police that were presenting, again, struck this chord about this dangerous devil's weed, which I do think left a lasting impression. Which, coming full circle, I can't imagine doing anything else, right? Because back in the day, I was a nightmare for recruiters. They're like, okay, let me get this straight. You trained and educated in England, but you're from Vancouver. You worked a little bit in corporate finance, but then you were in litigation dealing with securities fraud. We don't know where to place you. So I guess it was realizing that, the only way out of this is through it, and pulling myself up by my own bootstraps and realizing, hey, I have these unique perspectives as a medical patient. I grew up in weed, and in a degree and a proximity to it much closer than, the average person. And, the community and the people and, if you will, the mentality really resonated with me. And again, it was an environment where I still feel I can be myself. I don't have to, I can be authentic and bring in the experience that makes me relevant, from Copperhead Road to Wall Street or Bay Street and
Right.
back again, as
So
opposed to just being limited and doing stuff that you hate for
yeah,
Goldman Sachs.
totally, totally. And are you able to talk a little bit about your cases, some of the earlier days versus what things are looking at now? And eventually I want to lead into, psychedelics and some of the drug laws that are coming about
Yeah.
that way. Yeah. And I also want to hear about the ad lucem and the meaning behind the name.
Well, ad lucem means to or toward the light. So, having studied law at Oxford with lots of Latin and being a Freemason, which again, light or enlightenment is a big deal in Freemasonry.
Right.
So it was a name, again, that allowed me to, I guess, preach the values of Freemasonry that were important and applicable to law with a unique voice and a perspective, with a focus in effectively medical access and psychedelic access, and since legalization, all things in commercial cannabis. And
Right.
early cases, I mean, I had 40% of the Vancouver Board of Variants applications, again, for the dispensaries. And what ended up then leading into the Vancouver dispensary test case, which is by far the largest case that I was ever on. And I mean, we had an all-star cast. There was Kurt Tusaw initially was our lead lawyer. Jack Lloyd came in and joined. There was then me. John Conroy was in the background, but he's been trying to retire since I've known him for almost 10 years now. Still not retired. And but it was an opportunity for us representing our dispensaries. There was about 67 in total, and we had about a third of them each, right? There was Jack and Kirk, who myself, and then a guy named Dean Davison, who represented all of Don Briere's stores. So again, it was a little bit of an all-star cast, and it was these 67 dispensaries against the city of Vancouver, the province of BC, and the federal government. And the cool thing is those proceedings then replicated in other municipalities. Like Victoria was next. Victoria, after Vancouver regulated, decided it was going to. So it's like, wow, now we have got proceedings going in Vancouver and Victoria. And then it moved on to like Kelowna and Chemainus, and I think Abbotsford and a handful of others, which it was like throwing wrenches into the machine to jam it up so that we could bring and run charter arguments, right? Which we lost, but still, it for me was an opportunity to get your scars and bars and stars, as they say in the army, with
Yeah.
experience. And about a month and a half before trial, bloody Kirk buggered off to go work for Canopy. And that kind of was like, shit, what do we do? Our lead lawyer is working for Canopy now. I guess yeah, in any event, we had to talk to John, and John, pretty much came out of retirement, was like our lead lawyer, which was amazing. And we had 2 weeks of trial. And for me, it was a win. Even though we lost, we went the distance. We made our standing arguments, which I had a young woman working for me at the time who, those were the only arguments that we won in that case. And, to be honest, I really took that loss very hard. I mean, when you have 2.5 tours, which is what the 2.5 years felt like, in a battle with, multiple municipalities, the BC and the federal government, I was pretty worn out, burnt out, and exhausted. And well, to segue into psychedelics, I mean, it ultimately was what I think gave me my life back. I have friends in the psychedelic space, and because of the work in cannabis, I started getting the cannabis hardliners I knew that were also very, well known in the psychedelic space. People like Chris Bennett, the urban shaman, and Selena Ashenbaum, and a handful of others were like introducing me to, the top policy folks and drug experts like Mark Hayden, who was the former executive director of MAPS. And these people are like, we've heard of your work. Are you interested in collaborating and, being an advisor for this group and that group? And, it was incredible, just the opportunities. But, you can only build and go as high as you have a foundation to do these things. And well, I was pretty lucky. When I was probably at my most burnt out, I had friends, and not just friends. Most of these people were the cast members of the movie Dosed. which and in any event, they were like, you need to sit on my couch, basically. You need to do the work. And I'd done psychedelics before. I mean, who hadn't done mushrooms at Arts County Fair at UBC? I mean, half my fraternity did mushrooms on that day and would go to the conference. But that's different. That's like recreational, self-medication at best. But being introduced to psychedelic therapy, adhering to protocols and MAPS best practice and setting and intention and learning about all of these things. And again, just having had this experience of more drugs than hot dinners, I was pretty blown away by the experiences and the insight gained first from a pretty interesting deep dive involving psilocybin and the Bill Richards playlist, right, which a dear friend of mine took me through. Following that, about a month and a half later, Dennis McKenna, who I'd met at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, was like, you're coming with us to Peru, right?
What year was that?
That would have been 2018. I met Dennis, November 2018. And then, by January 2019, I was in Cuzco meeting up with Dennis, helping him with the incorporation of the McKenna Academy, and about 2 weeks of prep and 3 ayahuasca ceremonies. So, I mean, again, I just went, down the rabbit hole and just kept going deeper and deeper. In fact, I used to regard it as base jumping down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And ultimately, these medicines and microdosing and, developing an appreciation and a reverence and a connection. And believe it or not, I started realizing, like, wow, the shortcomings in my life, that's not anyone else's fault. That's my fault. The problems that I created earlier in my career for perhaps being too bold and brash and having zero social awareness and concept of boundaries. But you start realizing, like, wow, right? Like, that was me, for someone that would, for a time, it was anybody else's problem but mine. Psychedelics really put the zap on you.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, that first deep dive with the psilocybin, was literally like a birth, a death, a trial,
Oof.
a second coming, and a coronation, when a recognition of divinity within, which you think you're this person, but really you're this person. And you're going to have to do the work, address the issues, confront the problems that you've been reluctant to address. And I'm happy to say, like, I look back on all the work that I've done in 5 years and who I've got to meet and work with, right? Even including Therasil and helping them get their first Section 56. I mean, it was their lawyers, Jack Lloyd and Paul Lewin, who contacted me and like, Rob, we hear you've been working and hanging out with all these psychedelic guys. Any chance you could introduce us to Paul Stamets? And so on and so forth, which I did. I called Dennis and he's like, I'm like, Dennis, who do we want to talk to as an expert for psychedelic therapy? He's like, oh, you'll want to talk to Janice over at Hefter. And he's referring to Dr. Janice Phelps, who I got the psychedelic therapy piece, which, I meant involving or interviewing and liaising with Dr. Janice Phelps, who got the first license by the FDA and the DEA in the US for legal psychedelic therapy. So I asked her the question, just as a quick side note. I said to her, Dr. Phelps, can you be a sex therapist if you've never had sex before? And she kind of laughed and she says, I think I know where you're going with this. And I said, exactly, answer the question. And really it was, can you be a psychedelic therapist if you've never done psychedelics and have no idea of that connection of what Rumi would say is, if you're a drop in the ocean, you're still connected to that ocean, which is the greater divinity. So in any event, the opportunity to help myself and understand these medicines has really enabled me to show up with my A game as a lawyer. And just to sort of bring it even more full circle, I've had a fascination with Greenpeace and I guess environmental activism since about junior high.
Yeah.
And ultimately in that, the Greenpeace take a lot of what their ethos from the Quaker tradition of bearing witness. So really, how can you be a psychedelic lawyer if you've not borne witness? And so for me, it's like, for, you know, doing psychedelics and connecting with people that really know what they're doing and advising groups like Last Prisoner Project and Heroic Hearts UK, Heroic Hearts Canada, and, you know, Heroic Hearts US, Jesse Gould, he knows where to find me if he needs me. And it was really cool to meet him in November. So ultimately, and just a quick side note, you know, I wanted to be in the military when I was younger. In fact, both my grandparents were officers, and I failed the math portion of the officer's exam. And I can remember being in tears in a little suit and tie at Sinclair Center. I called my dad and I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to be an officer. And he goes, well, it's not the end of the world. And he says, you know, if you're going to fail at anything, fail at the military. And we both had a laugh. And again, telling my Greenpeace clients and activists about like that story. And now, you know, again, being an advisor to Heroic Hearts and being a voice for those who may not have one, and assisting, you know, special forces vets, Army Rangers, SAS, airborne, you know, for me, has been the opportunity to step up and be a voice for those who don't have one and engage in warfare with the government. So I'm pretty blessed to be where I am right now. And
what did you called it? Drug war correspondent at one point.
Yeah, you know,
I like that. That works.
That's sort of where I feel like, as a lawyer, yes, I wear my law hat, but I really do feel like, by virtue of being a lawyer, meaning you can meet with pretty much anybody legally, you know, with advice and exposure and knowledge of these things, you know, I definitely feel like, you know, a drug war correspondent as well, you know, that I am bearing witness, experiencing these things, and again, able to connect with those who have the ability to move the needle or who are doing activism and work, which again, ultimately is either going to move the needle with charter litigation. And there's a lot of interesting work in that space, but there's also a part that I haven't really spoken a lot about, which is the indigenous piece.
UNDRIP, yeah.
An UNDRIP. And, you know, I got my experience 10 years ago doing legal aid, where I ended up getting a legal aid case involving a hunting and fishing case, which involved a hereditary chief shooting seals and sea lions in Haida Gwaii. And again, having been in the military, understood ballistics, arcs of fire, lines of sight. And I mean, the amount of seals that they claim my clients had shot, where it was phenomenal. Like, I don't think they could have. I certainly couldn't have hit that many seals, and I'm a good shot. So again, you know, being able to like understand ballistics and forensics and, you know, under challenging the evidence gave me some insight and an appreciation to, like, there's a fourth level of government. There's a fourth type of law, right? You've got federal, provincial, municipal, but indigenous, or, you know, First Nations. And First Nations aren't municipal, they're their own municipality, right? Provincial government, certain laws and rules of general application apply on reserve, just as they do off reserve, but really they are a government unto themselves. So all the tips and tricks I learned fighting in that test case, representing all these dispensaries, which, you know, we all laugh now, that group of cannabis lawyers. I mean, I say that it was the best game of Risk we ever had. It was like City Hall, one City Hall against all these dispensaries. Like, we attacked them is how we look at it. And, you know, I was, as I said, pretty beaten up at the end of that. But a year or so after, plus with all the psychedelic work, indigenous clients and friends were reaching out saying, hey, you know, we saw what you did in a losing hand case, like commercial dispensaries. How do you think you might do with a winning hand? And I'm like, what do you mean by a winning hand? They mean us, First Nations, and not just First Nations, a particular group of First Nations that are sovereigntists. And at the end of the day, if you look at Indigenous law, if Indigenous have not signed treaties or extinguished rights that they had and have and possessed since time immemorial, that have not been extinguished or broken due to contact, there may be arguments. And in the case of bands that I've represented and individuals, well, Corey Brewer in Vernon, these Okanagan Indian band, they have words in their language for hemp, right? It's like Stetson is kind of how you phonetically say it and spell it, but it's not pronounced that way. And Kamloops, which is right kind of to the north of the north end of the interior, they have in their language words for hemp and words for cannabis. And it's interesting because you have this Scotsman, James Alexander Tate, who again documented and recorded all of this language back in the 1892s. He died in about 1920. But all the bands in the area, from the lower and upper Silkameen to the Nicola band to the Okanagan Indian band, like the language was effectively recorded and immortalized, right? And so when you look at some of these words, like rope is very similar to Stetson, which is similar to hemp in the language, right? So of course we got to get all this tested. But why this is important to cannabis is the definition of cannabis at Schedule 1 more or less says the definition includes all phytocannabinoids identical or similar to cannabis and non-derived cannabis sources. So technically echinacea, coneflower, orange peels, other products and things, or, materials that, you can extract phytocannabinoids from those, right? Which ultimately that would be caught under the cannabis regs for needing a processing license. So coneflower and echinacea are extremely similar to cannabis, like to the point that, it could be said they are identical, and even if they're not identical, the right of Indigenous when it comes to foraging, farming, gathering, right? Because hunting, fishing, gambling, tobacco have all been challenged and established in the courts as existing rights. And then just to bring it home here, you also have arguments dealing with nation-to-nation trade, right? That if Indigenous have been using plants and fungi that have been containing phytocannabinoids and medicines for food, social, and ceremonial purposes since time immemorial. And I mean, let's not forget, all of the psilocybin and mushrooms work had been driven underground with residential schools and banning of potlatches and everything else the federal government has done for over 200 years or 400 years to effectively extinguish many of these rights. Whether we win or not is not important. Well, yeah, I guess it is important, but you also have at play here the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. UNDRIP. Canada passed into law federally UNDRIP, which basically means they can't rule and come up with laws that are incompatible with the provisions. And there are provisions in UNDRIP such as access to traditional medicines and remedies and self-governance and political systems that are based on traditional values as opposed to the Indian Act, which we could get, that's a whole episode in itself. Really, UNDRIP is unique in British Columbia because BC is the only province which has implemented UNDRIP into provincial law as well through DRIPA, which is the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Persons Act, which ultimately, the view of the Indigenous, and about 4 years ago when, Corey and Tyler and other sovereigntist groups came to me, they were like, hey, we feel that, we have every right to be selling cannabis because there's also includes the right to economic self-sufficiency. Right. And it includes not just crown lands, but traditional territory. So in the case of Corey Brewer, traditional territory is downtown Vernon, where the airport is. Hence why Corey opened up a dispensary in downtown Vernon with the full permission and blessing of not just the regional chief, the local chief, band and council, but also the matriarchs, with a view of having Tupa's joint as a medicinal healing center where cannabis and other medicines. And so anyway, the CSU rated that. They've taken his cannabis. They won't return it. And we've brought a judicial review where we've claimed that, the government is bound to look at and consider these laws. And even in UNDRIP, when you take an Indigenous asset or, Indigenous property, ultimately, like, expropriating it is an instance of last resort. Like, there should be a form of compensation or trade or something, right? There wasn't. And, this money arguably would have been used and was going to be used for the band. I mean, again, if you're a dispensary and you're operating on banned land or outside banned land, you're kicking some of that money is going up, of course, to band and council and any of the other groups that are allowing you to operate, right? So, if you have that in place, there are compelling arguments for which we're trying to effectively raise, which my hope is to sum up that like legal, recreational, non-indigenous cannabis, I mean, everyone's getting their ass handed to them, right? It's the killing fields ultimately, and the government doesn't have to do jack squat, right? Like there's no charter rights when it comes to commercial business. But indigenous business is interesting because on one hand, there's medical and commercial. Where's the line? We don't know. So if these arguments are successful and the laws have to change on them, ultimately that could affect, for the benefit, the rules and regulations that are holding the larger cannabis industry back. So to really sum up, I think the legal cannabis industry needs the indigenous more than the indigenous need them.
Where are we at with regulatory reform and adult use psychedelics, like starting with psilocybin or something like that?
Well, it's the tale of two cities is the analogy that I will present to you, right? You've got Old Town, which is the black market. It's been there, and in Vancouver, you've got a number of dispensaries which have literally popped up like
it's deja vu for sure.
And Dana Larson, he's definitely been a huge drug war hero in harm reduction strategy. He literally is kind of the godfather in a good way. And he recently, through excellent lawyering by Jack Lloyd, they had their suspended retail license has been reinstated, which technically means they are the only legally licensed retail business that can sell psychedelics, which is interesting because it just really puts us to where things were maybe in cannabis back in 2010, 2012. I mean, back in 2010, 2012, there were about 5 to 10 dispensaries. You had your traditional BC Compassion clubs and Dana Larson and groups that were doing it, like the Edens and the early MMJs that, we're all doing this under a compassionate umbrella. And then as we marched closer to 2015, there literally was this explosion. And the court cases were proving this, that, each year that cannabis, there was a right and an access, and the conservative government had been overly restrictive on all this. So, it was about 15 years for cannabis in 2001 with the R.V. Parker decision, which was, 2001 Ontario Court of Appeal, to 2015 with City of Vancouver and the perfect storm of Justin Trudeau being elected as the leader of the Liberal Party and running on a cannabis mandate, right? I mean, he's fucked up everything he's touched pretty much, including legal cannabis, but it's pretty eventful at the end of the day with, where we are and all of that. But I mean, that took about 15 years of litigation from the first Section 56, which was R.V. Parker, to, the City of Vancouver implementing regulation, Justin Trudeau, and a federal mandate. So where are we in this? Well, the first in psychedelics, the first Section 56s, if you will, were August 2020. That was Thomas Hartle and Therasil. I helped, again, the Therasil's litigation team was some of that. They got the first exemption, withdrew their litigation, right, thinking they could work with the government. The government then went on to grant Section 56s, introduce or reintroduce the special access program. And I mean, there's always been clinical trial, but who can afford to do a clinical trial, right? So that was 2020. And, 3 years ago, then they changed the Food and Drug Act to effectively remove the barriers dealing with the new drug provisions that the conservatives had put into place. And thirdly, the Liberal government, I mean, it only took them 7 years, right, of being into power, but they removed substances like acid and psilocybin and a handful of others, including heroin, which was a separate case in Vancouver. But ultimately, that case led the basis for these other medicines being put back on to the special access program, which would enable doctors to be able to access these substances, provided like it was last resort and a whole bunch of other things had been done without result. So again, it's made it a lot more difficult because now all these charter challenges, right? Like Therasil's lost their charter challenges and their judicial reviews. Why? Because the courts give the judge, or the judges give the government way more deference, right? Because the government technically has 3 access points: SAP, Section 56, and clinical trial. And really no one is getting meaningful access to that.
Yeah.
Which again goes back to where Indigenous may very well be our best hope, because different rules are surround, the rules around access concerning how they can engage with those medicines. So, the tale of two cities, I see the, black market, which is Old Town, and anything else that's anything but legal. And then Newtown is, well, SAP, Section 56, and clinical trial, right? Unless you're, even medical patients who, end of life cancer patients have been denied and their requests haven't been renewed.
Yeah.
Which is ironic because you can just go into Dana's shop or order it online or get whatever you need from an oasis of other sources. So ultimately, something's going to have to give, because it doesn't look like the conservative doesn't look like the Liberals are going to be voted back in, which means the conservative government, if they form a majority, means it's going to be very difficult to liberalize any further access. And, that's good news and it's bad news. Where I think it is good news is that things have been static for way too long. And that's why I can't wait. I have been wanting Trudeau gone since 2019. I mean, he just disappointed me right out of the gate with cannabis, SNC Lavalin, AgaCon, scandal after scandal.
Not to mention the
pandemic.
pandemic.
Door, hits that guy on the ass, the better. Now, I'm not saying Poilievre's going to be any better, but if you don't shake up the system, which has just been static, and the government isn't in a position to deal with this, then nothing's going to happen. But in the case that the conservatives get in, maybe psychedelics and MAID will be a thing. But ultimately, if they go after Dana and these other practitioners hard, and police aren't really raiding them. They may raid Dana, but they sure are not convicting him. Right. And if the city's giving him a business license, which means there's going to be more and more people now popping up, the copycats always come out. Where we are, I think, marching towards where we were with cannabis in 2015. Things are just happening on a more expedited time frame. But ultimately, I think if the government changes, again, the conservatives always deal with drugs with a harder hand, which basically leave themselves open to charter challenge, which is how we advance to where Trudeau could have taken cannabis and really ran with it. But ultimately, he's ran it into the ground.
Yeah. It's just such a shame too, because we have all of this data and this research on like the clinical trials and the, the assistance for veterans and all of these people who are benefiting so much from this. And it's just, so.
It's been incredible, like being involved with Heroic Hearts, right? Heroic Hearts UK is interesting. I mean, Keith Abrams was a former Army he was a paratrooper, which like the Royal Paras in England are a serious thing. Like there's the SAS, which are special forces, but within the military, the paras are a big deal. And I mean, I knew guys at Oxford who then went on to Sandhurst, and they were in the paras and then were deployed into Afghanistan. But I mean, some of the shit these people have seen is incredible. And I mean, I know myself, having been in a reservist in the Canadian Armed Forces, they spend so much money to train you up. They train to kill, which, peacekeeping is a whole other thing. They have to then retrain the soldier who's trained to kill on now how to peacekeep, which is a little different than shooting first and asking questions later, right? Like we were taught effectively at a checkpoint, thunder, they come up with anything other than, market or garden or whatever the example is, you mow them down and like don't ask questions because they can different. Whereas peacekeeping, a lot different. And so with all of that, military spends so much money to train you. But in the case of Keith, like when you're finally sectioned out where it's like you're retired, it's literally like they drop you off at the orphanage and you got to figure it out. So the trauma of what you've seen in the military and what you've endured and just the PTSD, and then the military is there for you. But then when you're out and there's nobody, groups like Heroic Hearts have enabled, veterans to band together to be able to access these medicines. And in the early days, Heroic Hearts UK was taking people to Peru. Like in Heroic Hearts US, we're teaming up with Dennis McKenna and the McKenna Academy and going to Peru. Like when I did ayahuasca, I did it in Peru. And Peru's technically, it's legal under the national patrimony laws involving, pardon me, sacred plant medicines.
Right.
But really to see the dramatic turnaround where, someone was so distraught that they were ready to kill themselves because they just couldn't take anything, let alone just the rigors of showing up. Ultimately being able to re-engage with their family and re-engage with society and re-engage with themselves. It's, to me, I look at it as these groups need more assistance, they need more funding, and they need support from government, which in Canada, everyone's giving lip service to it and no one's doing it. And until the laws are broken and the laws are challenged, unfortunately, I think we're going to be playing second fiddle to the Americans, which, Oregon, we were light years ahead of Oregon and the States in 2020 when Therasil got their first exemption. However, now they have legal licenses in place. Heroic Hearts US, just end of Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving, they did, 14 vets over 5 days with multiple sessions at a ranch in Bend, Oregon. And again, it was above ground, legal. Senators, politicians were on board. I mean, so much more is happening in the United States, which, great, someone's got to be leading the charge. But what disappoints me is we were so far ahead. This was kind of like ours to fuck up. And what does Canada do best? Canada fucks it up.
Yeah, I know. And you're allowed to die here. You're allowed, medical assistance in dying, sure. And I can't experiment with my consciousness. It doesn't really add up. But so in terms of you mentioned Dennis McKenna again, are you still doing like maintenance doses? Are you still going down there? How's your psychedelic journey these days? Because you kind of do, because you forget, right? You do those trips and it's mind blowing, and then time goes on and you forget. So you do have to do those maintenance doses.
I'm really blessed because, my wife wasn't too sure what to make out of cannabis early in our relationship. She's a nurse. And, by the end of the test case, she'd seen, wow, cannabis is medicine. And she was pretty amazed to learn that Rona Ambrose, the health minister, didn't have any kind of medical or a degree in biology and an understanding of medical administration. I was like, no, she's a politician, right? So, she seeing the benefits of psychedelic therapy. My wife's part of or is in the Vancouver Island University's psychedelic assisted therapy program.
Nice.
So it's really cool with her as a nurse now learning from people that, I represent and have been legal counsel who, again, are tip of the spear in the, psychedelic assisted therapy world.
Nice.
So really for me, yes, I about twice a year try to do some deep dives with intention and purpose with, again, people who know what they're doing.
Yeah.
5-MeO DMT is the rules and the laws are not clear on it. So, until they are, I'm pretty happy,
with
confessing that with that.
with the synthetic or with bufo?
Well, that's the thing. I've only done the synthetic. I'd like to
Yeah.
do the bufo, but the folks who I've done it with trained under Ralph Metzner, that's kind of a big deal in the space. But the synthetic is about a 98% purity,
Nice.
whereas bufo in the wilds, I've heard, is maybe 15 to 17.
All right.
Still want to try it.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, that's the thing. There's more than one way to access these medicines.
For sure. And I think both are valid used appropriately because there's groups on both sides, and we should maybe
I think you need
leave
them
the
all.
frogs or leave the toads alone. Yeah.
But no, I mean, there's definitely ketamine. With ketamine on its own is very different than ayahuasca. Ayahuasca feels very much like you're in the jungle in nature. The visions feel more natural.
I actually had a full psychedelic trip this summer using ketamine and cannabis.
Well, I'd be interested in your views.
It launched me. I had the ketamine and then I smoked a joint, and it launched me. Like I was with a friend actually, and we had a joint trip. I'd never had a joint trip before. It was out of this world.
Okay, so I was invited in January to an Indigenous psychedelic healing circle put on by, practitioners who've been very involved with the Kamloops and doing psychedelic therapy for residential school survivors. So when you take like the protocols and Indigenous wisdom and fuse them, it's very meaningful. And no, ketamine, it was, ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin with 2 injections of ketamine. And I think there's something to be said though, when natural plant medicines are different, like it's different. You're feeling more like you're in nature.
Yeah.
But the ketamine is felt like you get like technology. There feels like there's futurism. Some people say, like, I joke, did you see Borgs or experience Borgs, which again are kind of hybrid machinery type things, which is very different, which you don't really get that with ayahuasca. You get more of like snakes, the jungle, crazy visions, things you can't explain, patterns, sacred geometry. I mean, you can definitely see where the Shipibo and the Icaros and the sacred geometry.
Yeah.
But again, you get different with ketamine. And so really at the end of the day, I think really the key is there's different tools for different jobs. And ultimately, I'd like to see these access points a lot clearer, because there's a lot of people out there. I mean, everybody could benefit from self-improvement and self-awareness and the insights from these medicines. And I don't think it's any coincidence that, psychedelics have been used throughout history. But again, it was done where like it was the high priests who would in the temple who would consume the cannabis and the other medicines
and the oracles
and then psychedelic use with the commoners or members of the tribe or the band, of course, would be associated with rites of passage. So really this, place where we're in now, I think there's a lot of potential for everybody, right? From king to pauper has the ability to connect with themselves with these medicines in meaningful ways to better know thyself, which, hey, if this helps deal with self-destructive, self-abusive behaviors, and develops an awareness of these things, which to me, that's a lot better going through life with an awareness and strategies than repeatedly shooting yourself in the foot and having no idea that what you're doing is causing the problem. So I really look at where I am at my life and my profession. And the last couple of years, I've really felt like, wow, I've done the work. Right now, I'm in a place where I can apply what I've learned, right, with confidence. And
the work never ends, Rob.
But it never ends. Work. Right. It's the next level.
Yeah.
These medicines don't fix you indefinitely.
No.
What they do is they show you have to do the work.
Yeah.
And, if you don't take care of yourself, if you're not, eating properly, and, being a lawyer is a very stressful profession, and
Yeah.
being a father of two young, busy children, and a
Yeah.
wife juggling a master's in psychedelic therapy,
Yeah.
and she's a nurse, which that's a very stressful profession.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, learning about how to avoid burnout and resetting and recognizing the signs to avoid a full burnout has been totally invaluable.
Mhm. Amazing. I think yeah, just what you were saying, there's different tools for different applications, but also for different people. We're all so unique. And I think as adults, there's a certain accountability that we can take upon ourselves to kind of figure out what works for us, depending on our beliefs, or, just what we're comfortable with in terms of the law, or, it's so vast. I feel like we're going in the right direction. A lot of work
Well, the
still.
trips get better. I mean, in the beginning, they were really hard. They're
Yeah.
confronting things and issues that I mean, they're pretty monumental. Um, but again, with experience and learning to connect with breath and
Yeah.
surrendering and
Yeah.
submitting, and uh,
Also just starting with meditation, right? Like being able to actually sit down and get quiet. People can't shut their minds off, and that's such an invaluable tool with just day to day, but also with psychedelics. And one of the Terrence McKenna things that comes up for me sometimes when I think about tripping or from having a hard time is singing, because that forces you to take breath, and that's another. And then you introduce sound, and vibrations.
oh
So
wow.
there's so much, right? But let's end it here. This has been phenomenal. I'm sure we will meet again, and maybe have some other guests and stuff like that, and chat with some more people. But yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Haley, and very grateful to Grow Opportunity to well, be a part of the podcast, and
For sure.
look forward to appearing with you again.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you.
Thanks, Rob.